A 2-year-old vanished, but nobody reported her missing for 31 days. And during that month, Caylee Anthony was seen partying at clubs, smiling in photographs, and giving investigators explanations that later came under intense scrutiny. A missing nanny, a fake job, contradicting timelines, and somewhere underneath all of it was a mystery investigators would spend years trying to untangle. Because from the very beginning, one question haunted the case. How does a child disappear for 31 days before anyone calls the police? Orlando, Florida, summer 2008. A city built around family vacations, theme parks, and sunshine, a place associated with childhood memories. But behind the neighborhoods and palm trees, one family was beginning to unravel. Caylee Anthony lived with her parents, George and Cindy, along with their 2-year-old daughter, Caylee. To people around her, Caylee appeared social, energetic, and outgoing. Friends described her as charismatic, easy to talk to, the kind of person who always seemed to have an answer for everything. But beneath the surface, tensions inside the Anthony household had reportedly been building for years. Responsibility, conflict, financial strain, dependence. And according to later testimony, complicated family dynamics would become central to the case itself. Then, on July 15, 2008, everything changed. Cindy Anthony made a 911 call. Her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days, and Casey's explanations were no longer making sense. "I just found out my granddaughter had been missing for a month. I need to find her." The panic in Cindy Anthony's voice immediately captured national attention. The call spread rapidly across television broadcasts, news stations, and the internet. And even before the investigation fully unfolded, one detail became impossible for the public to ignore. 31 days, not proof, not evidence, but a number that would shape how millions of people viewed the case. Some stories don't begin with answers. They begin with silence, with contradictions, with details that refuse to fit together. They force people to confront the uncomfortable space between suspicion and proof, between public judgment and legal certainty. And sometimes, even after the courtroom reaches a verdict, the questions never really disappear. I'm Justin Luther, and these are the Karma Case Files. Caylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005. She loved swimming, dancing, and playing dress-up. Photos of Caylee would later spread across television screens nationwide, transforming her face into one of the most heavily followed child disappearance cases in American history. Her smile became instantly recognizable, a symbol of innocence at the center of a growing national tragedy. Cindy Anthony played a major role in helping raise Caylee. George Anthony later described his granddaughter as the light of the family, their joy, their focus, their world. But beneath the routine of daily life, tensions reportedly continued growing inside the home. And in the summer of 2008, Caylee disappeared. June 16, 2008 would later become the last confirmed day Caylee Anthony was seen alive. Caylee Anthony was the mother at the center of the case. To many people around her, she appeared confident, social, and adaptable. Friends described her as someone who could fit into almost any environment, someone who always seemed to stay calm under pressure. But as investigators dug deeper into Caylee Anthony's life, the harder it became to separate reality from performance. Investigators would later testify that Caylee frequently gave conflicting accounts involving employment, finances, relationships, and Caylee's whereabouts. At trial, much would also be made of Caylee's claims involving family dysfunction and alleged sexual abuse by her father George. George Anthony publicly denied those allegations. The accusations deepened the emotional divide surrounding a case that was already consuming national attention. Meanwhile, investigators increasingly focused on Caylee's pattern of false statements. She claimed to work at Universal Studios despite not actually being employed there. She described friends and situations investigators later struggled to verify. And as law enforcement continued digging deeper, many of her explanations began collapsing. Because once investigators uncover repeated lies, every future explanation becomes harder to believe. June 16, 2008. The last confirmed day Caylee Anthony was seen alive. According to testimony, Cindy had contact with both Casey and Caylee that day. But afterward, weeks passed without George or Cindy seeing their granddaughter again. Casey offered explanations that sounded temporary. Caylee was with a nanny. Caylee was staying with friends. Caylee was traveling. But as the days passed, the explanations kept changing. And while Casey's stories shifted, Caylee was still nowhere to be found. George and Cindy reportedly questioned Casey about Caylee's location. Each time they received another explanation, another delay, another story. Then investigators encountered something that changed the emotional direction of the entire case. On July 13th, Casey's car was impounded due to unpaid towing fees. When George retrieved the vehicle, he later testified that the odor coming from the trunk resembled human decomposition. The smell was alarming and immediately intensified fears that something was deeply wrong. Casey reportedly dismissed the odor as trash, but Cindy later described the smell as something she could never forget. Then, on July 15th, after repeated questioning and growing panic, Cindy contacted authorities. "I have a missing child. My granddaughter has been missing for 31 days. That detail spread across television broadcasts and headlines almost instantly. A child's missing for a month and her mother unable to provide clear answers. When officers arrived at the Anthony home, the investigation intensified rapidly. Caylee Anthony initially told investigators that Caylee had been taken by a nanny, often referred to as Zanny. Investigators attempted to verify the nanny's existence. They searched addresses, phone numbers, employment records, but investigators later stated they found no evidence supporting Casey's story. As questioning continued, Casey provided additional explanations involving her employment, living arrangements, and Caylee's whereabouts. Many of those statements were later shown to be false or inconsistent. At one point, Casey led investigators through Universal Studios, claiming she worked there. According to investigators, she eventually admitted she was not employed by the company. Law enforcement examined Casey's phone records, financial activity, internet history, and social interactions. Photos and witness accounts showed Casey socializing and attending clubs during the weeks Caylee remained unaccounted for. Images from that period spread heavily through television coverage and online media. And for many people following the case, those images became impossible to separate from public perception surrounding Caylee Anthony herself. Investigators also recovered internet search history from the Anthony family computer, including searches related to chloroform. Prosecutors later argued those searches supported their theory of the case. The defense strongly disputed both the interpretation and significance of that evidence. For many people following the case, Caylee Anthony's behavior felt impossible to reconcile with the image of a missing child. Prosecutors later argued her actions reflected deception and avoidance. The defense argued trauma, dysfunction, and fear shaped her behavior after Caylee disappeared. Those competing interpretations would become central to the trial itself. As media coverage intensified, volunteer groups and search teams continued looking for Caylee. The Anthony home had been surrounded by reporters, cameras, and constant public attention. Every development fueled more speculation. Every interview generated more debate. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined evidence recovered from Caylee Anthony's vehicle. Experts for the prosecution later testified that evidence from the trunk was consistent with human decomposition, though aspects of that testimony were challenged by the defense. Investigators also focused heavily on internet searches recovered from the family computer, searches involving chloroform, neck breaking, and other disturbing phrases prosecutors argued supported premeditation. The defense disputed those conclusions and challenged the timeline connected to the searches. For months, the country had hoped Caylee Anthony would be found alive. Then, on December 11, 2008, investigators discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony home. The remains were later identified as Caylee Anthony. The case was no longer about finding a missing child. Now it was about determining how she died. Investigators also recovered duct tape near the remains, evidence that became crucial to the prosecution's theory during trial. The defense strongly disputed the significance of that evidence. But for many people following the case, Caylee's remains being discovered so close to the Anthony home intensified suspicion surrounding Caylee Anthony even further. Let's stop here for a moment, because this is where the case stopped being just an investigation and became something far more unsettling. Not because people only wanted answers, but because they wanted Caylee Anthony to behave in a way that made sense to them emotionally. And when she didn't, the public began filling in the blanks themselves. For many watching the case unfold, Caylee's behavior during those 31 days felt impossible to understand. Not just suspicious, because society has an unwritten expectation of what grief is supposed to look like. And when someone breaks those expectations, people don't just question them, they emotionally convict them. But this is where the case becomes uncomfortable, because human behavior is messy, and people do not always react to fear, dysfunction, or crisis in ways the outside world considers logical. That doesn't prove innocence, and it doesn't prove guilt. But it does force a difficult question. Were people judging the evidence, or were they judging the version of motherhood, grief, and morality they believed Caylee Anthony had violated? By the time the trial began, the courtroom wasn't just dealing with forensic evidence anymore. It was dealing with something far more powerful, a public that had already decided what kind of person Caylee Anthony was. The official cause of death was ultimately ruled homicide by undetermined means. Because of the condition of the remains, investigators could not determine a precise cause of death. There was no definitive answer regarding exactly how Caylee died. Still, prosecutors argued the surrounding circumstances pointed toward intentional homicide. Caylee Anthony was indicted on charges including first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated child neglect, and providing false statements to law enforcement. The trial of Caylee Anthony began in May 2011. Millions of viewers followed every development, every witness, every argument, every emotional exchange inside the courtroom. The prosecution acknowledged they lacked direct evidence establishing exactly how Caylee died. There was no confession, no eyewitness, no definitive forensic proof identifying a precise cause of death. But prosecutors argued the overall pattern of Caylee Anthony's conduct supported their theory of guilt. They presented testimony involving decomposition evidence, internet searches, cell phone activity, and Caylee's behavior after Caylee disappeared. The defense argued the state's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Then came one of the trial's most shocking moments. The defense claimed Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family swimming pool. The defense further alleged George Anthony helped cover up the death. George Anthony denied those allegations. The defense also repeated claims involving alleged sexual abuse within the family, accusations George Anthony denied publicly under oath. Throughout the proceedings, Caylee Anthony herself did not testify. Her voice remained largely absent while opposing sides fought to define what had happened inside the Anthony home. The trial became a battle of competing narratives, a prosecution arguing intentional murder, a defense arguing accident, dysfunction, and reasonable doubt. After deliberating for less than 11 hours, the jury returned its verdict. On July 5, 2011, Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was found guilty on multiple counts of providing false information to law enforcement. This is Karma Case File number 8. Investigators uncovered lies, contradictions, suspicion. But in a courtroom, Caylee Anthony was acquitted of murder. The trial ended, but the judgment never did. Because sometimes karma is not a prison sentence. Sometimes it's becoming permanently tied to a question the world refuses to let go of. A name forever connected to doubt, controversy, and the death of a child. And more than a decade later, people are still trying to decide what they believe happened in that house. I'm Justin Luther, and these are the Karma Case Files.